Usually, looking ahead to a vacation is much more exciting than thinking about it afterwards. But it wasn't the case in the instance that I'm going to talk about tonight. It wasn't a vacation. It was a lot of work. But it had some very thrilling experiences tied along with it. I don't know how many of you have ever visited the Middle East. I never had been out of the country before. As I told you when I spoke to you once before, my father, who has been in the ministry nearly 60 years, was a great student of ancient history. I perhaps inherited a distinct liking for ancient history. We spent a lot of time talking about places and biblical lands, but I never dared hope beyond my wildest dreams that I would ever get a chance to visit these places in person. But not too long ago, Elder Figure called Elder Snepper, our Union Conference president, and asked if I could be released to be part of a photographic team to go over into the Middle East to photograph some sound motion pictures for the It Is Written, one of our television telecasts, sponsored by the denomination. It didn't take me long to say yes, believe me. And so on a Christmas night, we left New York City by plane for London. It was quite a thrilling thing to see the lights of New York fade out into distance and know that there was a vast expanse of water under you and was going to be under you for a little while before we were able to hit land again. It gives you a few qualms, but modern aviation being what it is, people take it pretty much a matter of course. We got into England, into British Isles, about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I had always thought, I don't know what you folks think, but I had always thought that when you got to England, it would be just like America. You would be able to understand what the people said. It isn't so, believe me. I don't think I understood a half a dozen words all the time we were in England, unless it was just we who talked among ourselves. There were 3 of us in the team, Elder George Vandeman, myself, and another photographer. But these British people, they talk fast, and they've got a language all their own. They may call it the English language, but it doesn't bear very much resemblance to what we normally think of as the English language. One of the first things that we were after over in the English continent was in the British Museum. Now, the British Museum has a wealth of archaeological objects. And, of course, the material that we were to shoot in this motion picture was to be included as stock footage. In other words, when Elder Vandeman was talking about a certain thing, we would cut to these shots of the things that we were shooting so that it would be very authentic. We had scoured the stock footage libraries of Hollywood, but we couldn't find the material that we were after, and that's why the General Conference asked that we go over and get the material that would just suit and fit the particular program that we were working on. One of the things, of course, that has a very great impact in our doctrinal setup is the Rosetta Stone. Now, I'm sure you, especially who have taken denominational history, remember what the Rosetta Stone was. It's a black stone about that square and about that thick, but it had certain phrases in 3 languages. It was the key that unlocked the hieroglyphics of the Babylonian and the Persian languages. And this, of course, was something that Elder Vandeman wanted to definitely include in this series. So we got over there. We were carrying about 600 pounds of sound and motion picture gear and storage batteries, the whole works, and we dragged all this material into the British Museum. We got our lights set up, and of course this Rosetta Stone is in a mahogany case, had a great big thick glass over the top of it, and if you've ever tried color photography, you know what happens when you put some lights shining down onto a piece of glass that thick with a black onyx stone underneath. You don't see anything. Well, of course, we had come a long way and this was one of the things that we were after. So Elder Vandeman went to the head of the British Museum. He explained our plight, and he asked would it be possible if they could just lift this piece of glass off so we could get down and photograph the Rosetta Stone. Well, they tell me that the British people can really get right down mad sometimes, and this head of the British Museum surely demonstrated this facility. Why, he said, we don't even dare touch that thing. It hasn't been dusted in 20 years. What do you mean you want us to take the glass off? Well, Elder Vandeman explained that we had come some 10,000 miles, and this was one of the most important things that we wanted to photograph. Oh, it couldn't be done, and the British people are very set in their ways. But he kept on, and he wrung his hands, and once in a while there was just a little tear trickling down his cheek. And by the time he was all done talking to the head of the British Museum, he had a corps of carpenters in there. They not only took the glass off, they took the frame all around so we could get the whole thing. This was just our initiation into the experiences that we were to have for some 7 weeks and 18,000 miles. We worked all day and traveled all night for the 7 weeks. I think I lost about 30 pounds. Anyway, this was the type of a thing that we were after. This head of the British Museum was so cooperative after he'd had this good talking to by Elder Vandeman that he didn't quit being cooperative on the Rosetta Stone. He pointed to a great big long case, and it had a whole just a pile of round objects. They were some kind of pottery with hieroglyphics on it. It looked like if you would look at them, they would just disintegrate. We didn't dare touch them, but he says, these are just as important as this Rosetta Stone. So he says, we'll set a table, and you go get a piece of blue velvet, and you set it up and set your lights, and we'll set those things on that piece of blue velvet. So we spent 2 days photographing all of these wonderful hieroglyphics and archaeological pieces in the British Museum. From England, we went over to Germany and got some more equipment. We found that we didn't have enough with us. 600 pounds may seem like a lot, but it wasn't enough to do the job we were after. So we were over in Hamburg and then down into Munich, and we got some more motion picture equipment. From there, we went down through Switzerland into Rome. Now, one of the things, of course, that we were after in Rome was the Colosseum, because this had some biblical import in the series that he was picturizing on the It Is Written series. And so we got up early this morning after we got to Rome, and we started out for the Colosseum. Now, as I said, we had professional camera gear, all 600 pounds of it. We dragged this up the stairs way up to the top. The sun was just coming and made a beautiful shot. We got all set up and ground away a few feet, and then there was a tap on our shoulder, and there was I suppose it was a gendarme. It was some kind of a policeman there in Italy, in Rome. And he says, oh, you mustn't photograph this. Why? We said, we don't see any restrictions. Why? But he says, you're professional. If you were an amateur cameraman, you could go ahead and photograph as much as you want, but you're professional. Why? We said, what makes us professional? Oh, you're using a tripod. Well, the camera gear was too heavy. We couldn't hold it in our hands. And being law-abiding citizens, we said, yes, sir, but we'd still come 10,000 miles to photograph the Colosseum along with other things. And so we went down all those stairs with all this gear and got into the taxi that was to take us around, and we went way around to the other end of the Colosseum. And we didn't see any gendarmes, so we went way up in the top, dragging all this equipment with us, and proceeded to photograph until the policeman came and said, you mustn't shoot pictures here. You're professionals. Yes, sir, we had learned our lesson, so we packed all of our gear up, went downstairs into the cab, went around to one of the side entrances. Well, there's some 30 entrances, and by the time we had gone up each of the 30 entrances, we had shot all day and had all the material that we wanted of the Colosseum. There was one very interesting thing, however, while we were there at the Colosseum. One of the guides, and there are lots of them around in these places that always want to show you something, and we learned a word there that we were to hear all the time we were gone. That word has variations in different countries, but it means the same thing, and that word is bakshish. I don't know whether you ever heard it or not, but it means gimme. Gimme anything, but just gimme. And so this guide came, and he says, now, you know, you're here to photograph things about the Colosseum. He said, for a price, I can take you to a place that we don't show the average tourist. Well, of course, we were interested in anything out of the ordinary, and so we paid the price, and he took us down into a room way down, and he said, this is where they assembled the Christians before they were sent up into the arena and to meet the lions. And It was behind a great, big, massive iron door. And as we sat there contemplating this situation, we got to thinking about something. We wondered what it would feel like, what the thoughts would be of those Christians. We were standing on the very spot where those Christians probably were kneeling with their arms around each other for the last time, knowing that in a matter of minutes that they would be going up into the arena to be chewed and mauled by these lions. I just wonder if their thoughts would be the same as we sometimes find ourselves thinking on Sabbath instead of listening to the pastor. Or do you think that their thoughts were really serious? It's really something to think about. Because one of these days, you and I may be in a similar situation. Spirit of Prophecy talks about it. I just wonder what you would think if we were sitting here tonight and knowing that parked right outside this church door was a half a dozen big buses, that America had been taken over by another country. And these buses, as soon as this last meeting was over, were taking us to a concentration camp. I just wonder what our thought processes would be under such a similar situation. These were the thoughts that crossed our minds as we sat in this room where the Christians were. We had another very peculiar experience in Rome. We found that there was an old cathedral off the beaten path there in Rome. It's called St. Peter of the Chains. It's called that because up in this part where the altar normally is a casket. It's about that long. It's great big thick glass over the top of it, and there's just an old iron chain in there. But they say that this chain was the one that bound Peter, whom they called the first pope. That's why the church is called St. Peter of the Chains. The reason we found this church was because on one side of the altar is a huge statue of Moses sitting. But the peculiar part of this statue is that if you look at it from one angle, he's frowning. If you look at it from another angle, he's smiling. All the same statue. It's a very peculiar phenomenon. It's a great big white statue about 14 feet high, all made of white marble. So we had gone to a local motion picture concern there and rented some more lights and had everything ready out there, some generator trucks, because this was a much bigger thing than we'd anticipated in shooting. And so we asked the local padre if we could have permission. He talked through an interpreter, but that would desecrate the church. Now, if you go to the bishop, maybe he would. Well, we spent a half a day going up and up and up and up until we got to the archbishop of the entire diocese, or that section of the city of Rome. And so we asked him if it would be possible for us to get in there and photograph. No, he said it absolutely wouldn't. That would desecrate the church. We just couldn't allow it. Well, of course, we wanted this because this, you see, we weren't just shooting wild. We had scripts for every minute of the time that we were there, and we were shooting particular objects that had all been planned and cleared through the State Department before we ever left America. And so this was one of the things that we needed. And so, again, Elder Vandeman went to work on this good prelate, and finally he said, "You know, Pastor," he said, "I haven't had a vacation in an awful long time." Now, he said, "We maintain a very nice little villa down on the Mediterranean, and he said, I haven't been there for a long time." Now, he said, "If I should suddenly find $200 in my pocket," he said, "I'm inclined to think that I would take 3 or 4 days off and spend that time down on this villa." And he said, "Of course, if I wasn't here," he said, "there would be nobody that could refuse you permission to shoot that image." He got the $200, we got the pictures of the image, and everybody was happy. From Rome, we went to Cairo. We spent nearly 10 days in and around that place. Of course, the pyramids are a very interesting place. We climbed them. Believe me, we didn't do it as fast as the native boys. For $1, they'll run up and down in 8 minutes. It took us an awful lot longer than that, even though we had native boys to carry our equipment up there. It looks like it would be very easy, that it's quite an angle, but each of the steps or stairs is about that high and about that wide, and by the time you clamber onto one, it looks like it's the face of a sheer wall right there. But anyway, we did climb this. We went down to Karnak and Thebes and the Valley of the Kings and Tut's Tomb, all of these places that were included. The most interesting place, though, I think, was when we went down to Sinai from Cairo. We stayed in the Heliopolis Palace Hotel just outside of Cairo. They said this was a palace of the reigning monarchs of Cairo at some time, that the Palace Hotel had been a palace some 500 years ago. Believe me, the hotel smelled like it was 500 years old. The food there wasn't exactly appetizing. The waiters, when we went down for breakfast, they were dressed in white pantaloons. At least they perhaps were white sometime around Noah and the Ark. I don't think they'd been washed since then. Their hands hadn't either. And when they came bringing your glasses of water, their fingers were weighed down in, and that was the end of any appetite that you might have had. I don't know whether they didn't want customers or what. But anyway, we started out from Cairo, from this Heliopolis Palace Hotel, to go to Mount Sinai. It's a 16-hour trip. We rented 2 taxi cabs, old 1941 Chevrolets. They were the only ones that would make the trip, because packed on top of them were enough gasoline for the entire round trip. It's 460 miles each way, no gas stations from the time you leave till you get back to Cairo. And besides that, they had to carry enough spare parts to build an entire car for both cars, rear ends, transmissions, motors, the whole works. And then we had to ride too. And so we started out at daybreak for this 16-hour ride down to Mount Sinai. There are no roads. I don't see how anybody would ever know, because it was just like going down a dry wash with just cobblestones and mountains and everything. They called it the Wilderness of Zin, and it surely was a wilderness. We spent our time reading patriarchs and prophets as much as we could read, bouncing along in these old Chevrolets going down there. Because we wanted to get the picture of the travels of the children of Israel. Because we passed the pool of Ephraim and the pool of Merah and all these various places that are mentioned so graphically in the Spirit of Prophecy, and it really made a setting so that we could get the angles that we were after in photographing this particular trip. We got down to Mount Sinai, to St. Catherine's Monastery, about sundown that night, and we stayed there in St. Catherine's. The next morning we started up Mount Sinai. It's a 5,000 or 6,000 foot climb. You can do it the easy way and spend 2 days and pay some money and take a camel and go around, but we decided we didn't have time to do that, and we wanted to do things the hard way anyway, and so we climbed up. An old monk had spent 70 years, his entire life, digging hand and toe holes going straight up this mountain, and that's the way we went up. How Moses at 80 years old ran up and down Mount Sinai that way, I don't know. I sure found out how old I was in a hurry, because I was puffing and wheezing before I got halfway up. It's a very interesting place. Of course, there are 2 concepts of the point where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Many denominations hold that the Mount of Moses is the spot. Our denomination rather feels that Mount Suf, further on up, is the place where Moses probably or presumably received the tables of stone, because it was from this point that you could look down over the pass in the valley, right over the place where Aaron built the golden calf. And most of our leaders feel that this is the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments. When we came down, we were guests of the monks there at St. Catherine's Monastery. Now, this monastery is about 1,500 years old, and it's quite an interesting place. It's built around the burning bush, and there within the walls of this monastery is a bush that's constantly ablaze. And they tell you that this is the original burning bush of Moses' time. We had metal reservations, but we let them talk. Of course, one of the most interesting things there is the bone room. Now, in St. Catherine's Monastery, these monks devote their entire lives to this particular place. Now, when they die, they are buried in a plot of ground out in the back, and they are allowed to rest for 6 years until the worms have eaten all the flesh and everything off from their bones, and then they are their bodies are dug up again, and the bones dismembered and taken to this bone room. Now, this bone room is perhaps half the size of this auditorium. It's down underground, and we were given a cook's tour of this place because it was very sacred to these monks. And in one corner were nothing but skulls packed clear to the ceiling. Then you go to the next section, there are finger bones, just piled clear to the ceiling, just all nestled in. Then comes ribs and all the other bones of the body, each one in its own place. We couldn't help but think that this was surely something for the monks to look forward to, that when they passed on after spending their life of service in this monastery, that this was where they were going to end up. We couldn't help but think of the choice that Moses made when he decided, rather than be a pharaoh or in the king's household, that he would rather spend his life with God's chosen people. And you know where he is now because, or as a result of that choice. We got back to Cairo the next night, and we took a plane from there over to Petra. Now, Petra is an extremely interesting place. It's called the Rose Red City, that's 3,000 years old. We landed in the middle of the desert, not even in an airfield, and there we were met by another old taxicab that took us to a military outpost, and then we were put on horses. I had never been on a horse before, and if you have an idea of what such a situation is, maybe you can appreciate my predicament. I found that the language barrier is not confined between humans, that it also exists between animals over there and human beings. We got on and we started down. It's about a 3-hour ride down into Petra itself. And this horse looked very nice. I talked gently to him, like you read that you're supposed to talk to horses, but it didn't make any difference. I'm not sure whether he was paid by the Chamber of Commerce or not, because as we were going down this pathway, down the side of this mountain, sheer rock up this side, way down in the valley on that side, and on this side of the road were nothing but cobblestones. Then there was a path that was fairly smooth. But do you think that horse would take the smooth path? No. He had to go and stumble and go down on his knees over these stones with me trying to hang on. And then if that wasn't enough, I don't know whether he wanted to give me a thrill ride or what, but he would reach down over the edge for a little blade of grass, and it was 1,000 feet straight down, and me trying to hang on for dear life. And if you tried to steer the horse, if the language didn't work, you could bend his head double and he looked at you. It didn't do any good. He just went on stumbling in his own way. But anyway, after 3 hours of this kind of an experience, we finally broke out into Petra. It's the most wonderful sight that you ever saw, because this entire mountain, like that, the entire face of it is covered with the most beautiful temples carved out of this rose red, right in the face of the mountain itself. This is the old land of the Edomites that we read about in the history of the children of Israel. Later on, the Edomites were conquered by the Nabateans, and the Nabateans were still a ruling power, a factor in the Middle East at the time that Jesus was here on earth. But we walked all the way around this mountain and looked at all of these. They have beautiful colonnades and then temples and everything in, but on the backside are some steps that go way up to the top. Elder Vandeman has one of his programs in It Is Written series called Red Stairs to the Sun, because they were Baal worshippers. They worshiped the sun. And we climbed those stairs, and up on top there was a temple on one end, and then a great big long sacrificial altar in front. This was a white marble altar, and every so often were hollowed out places so that the human sacrifices could rest their heads in these little indentations so that they wouldn't roll around just before that they took the axe and chopped their heads off. Then they had little drain pipes on each side so that the blood would trickle down into the vessels which was used in their sacrifice. We have motion pictures in sound of all of this, and it's included in this It Is Written series. From Petra, we went up to the Dead Sea area. We were going to photograph the Dead Sea caves and then on to Jerusalem. The Dead Sea, of course, I didn't have too much of an idea. I thought it was an old, dirty, green, scum-covered duck pond. That was my idea. It's not. It's just as blue as Lake Michigan. It's just as clear. You can see every stone on the bottom. There's no odor to it. It's about 60 miles long, perhaps 20, 25 miles wide, and you wouldn't think of it as anything but a nice, clear, freshwater lake until you wiggle your hand in it or try to, and then it's just like you put your hand in a basin of Cairo syrup. You just don't wiggle your hand, that's all. And if you try and walk into it, you can keep on walking, but pretty soon you find that you're just treading water or whatever the material is that the Dead Sea is composed of, because you don't sink beyond that. You can just keep right on walking right on out there. But anyway, from the Dead Sea we went up to Jerusalem. We were scheduled to stay at the Shepherd's Hotel, but somehow our reservations got crossed up and they put us in the National Hotel. Now, we had quite an experience there, because the thing that we didn't know about the National Hotel, it was just 3 blocks outside of Herod's Gate, was that the man who owned this hotel, it's a very modern hotel, a very good Muslim, had just returned from the United States. It seems that a number of years ago his son had decided that he was going to be like the prodigal son. He took his inheritance. He wanted to see the world in America. So he saw the world and he landed in America, and somehow he wound up in Southern Missionary College, and he saw a beautiful pair of blue eyes down there that intrigued him. He got married. He became an Adventist. He went on and took a dentist course and is now practicing dentistry in the southern states. Well, his father had just spent 3 months at the home of his son there in the southern states, trying every way possible to entice him to come back to Jerusalem and be a good little Muslim. And the only way he got was to come back armed with a whole bunch of our books. Well, he had just got there the day before when we landed at this hotel. We didn't know any of this until after, but anyway, we had been photographing down at the Dead Sea all day. We were very tired. It was hard work because we were climbing up and down these mounds and these caves, and it was a very clean place, one of the most clean places, eating-wise, that we hit. And the first thing they brought to us was lentil soup. It was the best-tasting lentil soup I have ever eaten. It was a bowl about that big around, about that thick, and it was just the best. Of course, being hungry, you know, it helps a whole lot, but this had spices or something in it, I don't know, that just gave it that kind of a taste that really went well. Well, as I say, we were real hungry, and I thought, well, now, there's no use in asking for anything else, and so when I had finished this bowl of soup, I decided, well, I'm going to order a second, and then I'll call it a day. And so I had a second bowl. I asked if I could have it, and he said, sure. So he brought me a second bowl just like the first, and I got away with that. I had a couple corners left over, and I said, could I have just a half a bowl more? Sure. And so he brought another half bowl. The thing we didn't know was that there were 9 other full courses coming, and that a Muslim is insulted unless you eat just as much of all the other 9 courses as you do that first course. We learned never to order seconds again on anything. But in and around Jerusalem, there are a number of things that we learned there that were very, very interesting. I don't know what you folks think about the Arabs. I was greatly disillusioned. I always thought that they were dirty old heathen. They're not. They're well-educated, they're well-dressed, they're courteous, far more courteous than most people you find on the streets here in America today. They know the story of the Bible. They can tell you all about the history of the Bible. After all, they're sons and daughters of Abraham, the same as the Jewish people are. And they were just most courteous to us. But they took us around. Of course, we had to be protected. We didn't go into Israeli at all, or into Israeli sector. We had to sign a thing on our visa that we never had been in Israel, and that we never in our lifetime would go into Israel. Because if you ever do go, you never can go into an Arab country again. And 90% of the things of biblical import are on the Arab side. So the only 2 things that we didn't see was the Sea of Galilee and Nazareth that were on the Israeli side that we were really after. We were down in King Solomon's stables, way down underground, and we were over in Gethsemane and Mount of Olives and all those places. But I think the most interesting place was in the very basement recesses of a monastery, right in the center of the Arab sector of Jerusalem. An old Catholic priest had decided in his study that when Jerusalem was razed in AD 70, and the prophecy was that there wouldn't be one stone left on another, we know that this was true, and so in Jeremiah's time, when they went back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, we've been studying this in our Sabbath school lessons not too long ago, instead of scraping this down to the original street level, they just merely leveled the thing off, and there's from 12 to 30 feet difference between the street level of the streets today and what they were during Jesus' time. Now, he had worked this out, and so he bought a piece of property there in the Arab sector of Jerusalem that he felt was right over Pilate's Praetorium. and they built a monastery around it, and then they dug down, and there they found, about 14 or 15 feet below the street level, they found the original streets. But they also found Pilate's Praetorium. And right in front of the throne seat of Pilate's Praetorium are 12 stones, and each one of these stones is perhaps that square. It must be about that thick. They weren't put together with mortar or anything. But the peculiar part of the thing is that on the surface of each one of these stones are inscriptions. It's something like the game tic-tac-toe we used to play when we were children. There are X's and crosses and circles with letters in them and all of these things. Now, the story behind this thing is that on a certain day each year, when there were political prisoners of the Roman government, if the soldiers had been real good soldiers and hadn't caused too many complications for the ruling powers, that if there were a political prisoner condemned to death, instead of putting him to death officially by the Roman government, they were turned over to the soldiers at this particular place on these stones. And the soldiers could do anything they pleased with that prisoner on these stones. They could stick him easy or stick him hard. The only requisite was that the prisoner be dead come sundown. But it was all part of a game played with these hieroglyphics on these stones. On these very stones was where Jesus stood when he was crowned with the crown of thorns and had the purple robe put on him and hailed Jesus, King of the Jews. We have those pictures. From Jerusalem, we went up to Beirut and then over to Baghdad. Now, before I go into this Baghdad situation, I must tell you that before we ever started on this trip, the Commissioner General's wife of the country of Lebanon was in Washington. This was 4 or 5 months before we ever even thought of going on this trip. And during her stay in Washington, she saw 2 of the telecasts of the It Is Written program. And both of them happened to be on diet. And she was so impressed that she went out to Tacoma Park to the General Conference offices and had an audience with Elder Figure and also one with Elder Vandeman. She wanted to know more about what Adventists believed. And she bought every cookbook and everything that we had on diet at that time out there from the Review and Herald. And then when she left the General Conference office, she said, "Now, if any of you folks ever come to Beirut, you are to be guests at our palace there," because he was next to the king of Lebanon. Well, you accept things like that, you know, and shrug it off and think nothing of it. We didn't think anything more of it at all. But we left Jerusalem and were headed over to Baghdad. From there we went on up to Nineveh, and we sat on the spot where Jonah sat and contemplated the city of Nineveh. We looked at this one gate that has been unearthed. We went a little bit to the west out on the plains of Shinar, and our guide told us and showed us a big mound of earth there, that this was one of the places where political prisoners were burned to death. Now, whether this particular place was the fiery furnace of the Daniel story, we don't know, but it probably was something similar to that. Then we went back to Baghdad, went down to Babylon. We photographed Babylon from all angles on the ground, and we didn't get exactly what we wanted, so we went back to the airport and rented a 2-engine British ship, British plane, took the door off and strapped our camera gear and ourselves into the opening, and our pilot flew sideways so we could fly over Babylon, just scraping the top and get the photographs from that angle as well as from the ground. Then we got on a plane and we headed back for Beirut. We couldn't help but think of something flying over to Babylon, however, and that was that we were traversing the same area that Daniel did when, as a boy, he was taken prisoner over to the kingdom of Babylon. And we couldn't help, as we were going in the plane and looking down at all this ground passing under us. I'm sure the 3 hours that we did it in was far shorter than the time it took Daniel to go over the same area. But we couldn't help, as we sat in our little group on the plane talking, thinking about the experiences of Daniel. Just a young chap, about 16 or 17, and here his country is invaded. All of a sudden, he's taken prisoner and taken to this new country. I can imagine his processes, his mental processes, worrying about what was going to happen. You remember the story of what happened. One of his first experiences was on diet, wasn't it? He was asked to eat the king's meat and drink the king's drink. and he refused to do that. Now, don't you think it would have been logical for him to think, well, now here, I'm a prisoner in a foreign country. I know there's no more Hebrews over here that are going to tell anybody if I drink the king's drink and eat the king's meat, and if I'm going to have any influence on the king at all, I'd better not start saying no right off the thing. And I'm sure that some of us would have thought the same line. Well, as we thought about this, we thought about the choice that Daniel made. He determined in his heart with the other Hebrew men that were with him that he was not going to defile himself in any way, shape, or form. Well, as we thought about this, we decided that if the Holy Spirit was going to use the pictures that we were shooting, that we must pass the same test, that we weren't going to do anything in talking and eating and anything that we did that would in any way rob the potentiality of the Holy Spirit working through the pictures that we were working on. So anyway, we were on this plane headed back for Beirut. And as we were circling the airport in Beirut, we looked down there. Here was a lot of people down there, and there was a band, and there was a bunch of soldiers, and a lot of jeeps and things, and we didn't know what to think, and the plane kept circling around. We kept looking down, and we decided among ourselves that there must be some dignitary on the plane, so we started craning our necks to see if we could see who the dignitary was on this plane. We couldn't see anybody that looked any different, and so we decided that we'd sit there and wait until the rest of them got off, and when the band would start playing, why, we'd know that that was the dignitary, and then we would have seen a dignitary over there. So we landed, and the band came up and stood, and the soldiers around them, and all the vast concourse of people out there, and each of the other people filed out of the plane. The band didn't play at all. Finally, there were just the three of us left on the plane. We had to get out. And so as we started down the ramp off the plane there, the band started playing Star Spangled Banner. We were the guests of honor, and there stood the Commissioner General, the next to the king of the country of Lebanon. And he greeted us and told us that we had treated his wife so nice when she was in Washington that they wanted to reciprocate. We'd forgotten all about this other situation. And so he took us into the airport, and normally, you know, over there in those countries, these customs officials try to show how efficient they are. They go through every little thread and everything you've got in your suitcase. And besides our personal stuff, we had all of the 600 pounds of camera gear and other things that we had gotten. And sometimes we spent 4 or 5 hours in a customs office before we were cleared. But as we were standing in there talking to the Commissioner General, they have one of these ramps coming in off from where the plane lands, and he said, now when your bags come in, you point out which are yours. And so as our material started coming in on this ramp, we'd point out, well, that's one of ours. The Commissioner General would say something in Arabic, and one of these red capped soldiers would run, grab the thing, and out the door into this jeep before the customs officials even had a chance to look at it. In less than 5 minutes, all of our stuff was stowed away in these jeeps, and we were out of the airport. And he took us to the palace, and then he told us, now he said, you realize that Lebanon and the Arab countries aren't on the best of terms with the Israeli country, and so he said, we have appointed Colonel Nasser, the head of the military government of the country of Lebanon, as your personal guide and advisor while you're here. Now, he will see to it that you have just anything that you want. And he was a very intelligent man. He was, as I say, the colonel, the head of the military government of the country of Lebanon, and he introduced himself to us, and he said, now we must fill out certain forms, and so we filled them out, and he helped us. Now, he said, tomorrow we'll start out. The thing that we were after, of course, was going down to Tyre and Sidon. It's not called Tyre and Sidon anymore. It's called Tyre and Sidon. I suppose it's the French influence. But anyway, we were going down to Sidon that had been completely demolished in the time of Alexander the Great, and they used the stones to build this causeway out into the Mediterranean. And so this was one of the things that we wanted for our series of pictures. So we started out the next morning in the colonel's private car. It was a limousine with a chauffeur, a military chauffeur, had 2 flags with stars on, gold stars, which meant that he was the head of the military government. We rode in that, and then there were 3 jeeps behind us full of soldiers with our camera gear and personal material in there. And now every 10 miles in Lebanon, there's a military checkpoint where you're supposed to stop and show your visa and be fingerprinted, and sometimes it takes as much as 2 or 3 hours. There were half a mile of cars in both directions waiting to go through this process. And as we'd go down the road there, the minute this entire group there at these military checkpoints would see the gold stars in this car, everybody saluted, and the car just went right on around. Nobody stopped at all. We were in the car with the head of the military government. And so in just a matter of a few hours, we were down to Sidon. Now, right across the entrance, or the beginning part of the old city of Sidon, was a great big sign, absolutely no photography. And when we got down there, there was a squad of soldiers under a lieutenant standing with drawn bayonets to guard the entrance to this old city. The colonel said, don't worry about it. He said, I'll take care of this. And so he got out of the car, and of course they were standing at salute then because he was the head of the military government. And he said, now, Lieutenant, he said, I have some things of very great governmental importance that I must discuss with you. Now, he said, I'm going to leave my soldiers here, but you take your soldiers and put them in one of the jeeps, and you come with me, and we'll go into town. I don't know whether they drank malted milks all day or what, but anyway, we didn't see them for the rest of the day, and the colonel's soldiers took our camera gear, and we photographed until almost sundown in this forbidden place. Well, just before sundown, the colonel came back with the soldiers. Our stuff was all packed up and back in the jeep that was left. Nobody was the wiser. So we got into the colonel's limousine, and he said, now you realize, Pastor, he said, this isn't the way we normally treat our guests and our own soldiers. He said, I realize that the sun isn't up too long. It was the winter time when we were there. And so he said, you haven't taken time to eat. I'm sure that you're very hungry. And he said, I know my soldiers are. So he said, you're to be guests of the country of Lebanon at this villa down on the Mediterranean on the way back to Beirut. Well, this sounded very fine. So we started back toward Beirut, everybody happy. We got about halfway down there, and we stopped at this great big hotel right on the Mediterranean. We were taken in to a patio out right just off the Mediterranean Sea there, the beautiful waves rolling up. Oh, it was a beautiful place. We were given a nice table with a full view of this, and then on each side was tables for the soldiers. We sat down and we talked for a few minutes, and then the colonel said, now, Pastor, he said, do you want tea or coffee? Well, we remembered a statement in the Spirit of Prophecy in a book called Counsels to Diet and Health that drinking coffee is a sin. And we were sure that if we committed a sin, that the Holy Spirit wasn't going to work through the pictures that we were making. So Elder Vandeman, who is, if you know him, is always a master of almost any situation, he said, now, Colonel, he said, as we were riding along toward Tyre and Sidon, he said, we were very much impressed with your orange groves. He said, you grow the biggest oranges here that we have ever seen. And they were just like grapefruit. I never saw anything like it. He says, we don't have this kind of oranges in California or Florida. Now, he said, don't you suppose that you could have a nice big glass of orange juice out of these great big oranges? He said, we'd sure love that. Well, Colonel looked at him, kind of smiled, and he says, now really, Pastor, he said, I appreciate your interest in our agricultural pursuits, but he said, I didn't ask you whether you wanted orange juice or not. He asked you whether you wanted tea or coffee. Well, Elder Vandeman said, well, Colonel, we don't drink tea or coffee at home, but we sure would like a glass of that orange juice. He said, I'm sure it just tastes fine. The colonel looked at him a minute, his face started getting a little red. He said, Pastor, you're beginning to irk me. He said, I want to know whether you want tea or coffee. Well, Elder Vandeman says, if it isn't possible to have this orange juice, he said, can we have a glass of water? The colonel said, Pastor Vandeman, he said, do you know what you have just done? He said, you not only have insulted me personally, Colonel Nasser, but you have insulted the country of Lebanon. Well, here we're 10,000 miles from home in a foreign country, and these red-capped soldiers, we weren't too far from the Russian border in Siberia. We began to wonder if the salt mines were, if that's where we were going to wind up. It causes a person to wonder. Also, something else crossed our minds. Here we're 10,000 miles from home, just the four of us. Nobody would ever know, and we were sure that nobody was going to tell if we drank a cup of coffee. We were sure that a cup of coffee wasn't going to kill us. But you know, the thing that kept going back in our minds was the situation of Daniel when he went over there and refused to take the king's drink. And so we didn't take any. And this colonel was just absolutely furious. His face was just as red. He says, you know, over here in the Middle East, people don't like Americans. He says, I know why. And he says, no, I don't like Americans. He says, I wish I could drop you right here, right now. But he said, Oriental courtesy dictates that I've got to give you a drink of water if that's what you want. And so he snapped his fingers, and they brought us a glass of water, and he drank his coffee. And then when that was done, believe me, the atmosphere was getting thick. You could begin to cut it, just a little bit. And so he called, and the waiters came in with a great big dish, a platter. There was some kind of a bird on it. It had 2 legs sticking up anyway. I don't have any idea what it was. And he put one in front of each one of us. Well, the colonel broke off a leg and started to eat on it, and we sat looking at this plate. And he looked up and saw that we hadn't started to eat, and he says, what's the matter with your food? Elder Vandeman says, well, Colonel, he said, we're vegetarians. We don't eat meat. He said, you're what? Elder Vandeman says, we don't eat meat. He says, this does it. He says, I didn't think I'd ever meet with people like this. He said, I'm not even going to talk to you anymore. But he says, I can't leave you go hungry. He said, regardless of what my personal feelings and thoughts about you are, he says, I can't do that. And so he called the waiter, and here came the waiter. He had a nice round platter, mashed potatoes, some peas and beets and corn, a glass of milk, all prepared. We ate very quietly. The colonel never said a word. His face was just as red as the caps on his soldiers. When we got done, he motioned that we were to get back in the car. He wouldn't even talk to us. We got back in and drove on the rest of the way to Beirut. We got into the Commissioner General's office, and he was signing some papers with some person in there, and we had to wait a few minutes. And while we were out in the anteroom, the colonel started to smile. Vandeman says, well, what's the joke? Let us in it. We could stand a little humor right about now. And Colonel said, well, Pastor, he said, I should apologize for the way I acted. He said, I was kind of a bore. Vandeman says, don't think anything about it. He says, after all, we're in a strange country. We don't know the customs of the people over here. Just don't think anything about it. No, he says, I can't let it go that way. He said, I've got to apologize. Vandeman says, don't think any more about it. No, he says, let me tell you something. He said, when the Commissioner General's wife was in Washington, she heard 2 of your telecasts. She went out to your head offices. She came back and told the Commissioner General that Seventh-day Adventists would rather die than commit a known wrong, which included their diet doctrine. The Commissioner General said there wasn't anybody on earth that would rather die than drink a cup of coffee or eat a piece of meat. The colonel said, I had orders to get you to drink coffee and to eat that meat right up next to a firing squad. He said, in the event that you didn't, we had those vegetable plates prepared ahead of time from your own cookbooks. What would have happened if we had drank that cup of coffee? It wouldn't have killed us, would it? The sequel to this thing is that the next night we took the Commissioner General and his wife and Colonel Nasser and his wife to a big hotel to dinner. It had no coffee and it had no meat. It was a vegetable plate dinner and orange juice to drink. The Commissioner General was a big enough man. This was a huge dining room in the biggest hotel in Beirut. There was an orchestra playing. There was perhaps 150 people dining. The Commissioner General wanted to talk. He called the owner of the hotel and he says, fire the orchestra and get rid of all these people that are eating. I don't care whether they've finished their dinner or not. And he had to do it. We wanted to be alone. For 3 hours, he pumped Elder Vandeman on what Seventh-day Adventists believe. Colonel Nasser is sending his son to the Middle East College this September. What would have happened had we taken that cup of coffee? It's something serious to think about. So many times young people, they get out into another town. They know nobody is going to see them. There's no Adventists around. And sometimes they lower their standards. We never know what God is planning, like Philip and the eunuch, in bringing people within our paths. It's something serious to think about. You know, when I was over in Hamburg, Germany, I ran into a fellow called Fritz. You know, so many times young people say, well, you read the story of Daniel, you read the story of Joseph and all these things and the wonderful experiences that they had, but that was 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Those things don't happen today. I want to tell you, and this will be my closing story, the story of Fritz during the Second World War. A young German boy, about 17, just the age of a lot of missionary volunteers. He was a call porter over there during the Second World War, selling Our Day in the Light of Prophecy. He was having remarkable success. But of course, the book, Our Day in the Light of Prophecy, foretold that Hitler couldn't possibly succeed. And so after he'd been selling this book for a number of months, the military finally caught up with him. And they stopped him in this town and said, Fritz, you mustn't sell this book anymore. And so he, being a good law-abiding citizen, he packed up his prospectus in his pocket, went on to the next town, proceeded to sell the books. The military caught up with him again, said, Fritz, you mustn't sell books in this town. Fritz says, okay, I won't sell books in this town. He put his prospectus back in his pocket and went on to the next town. Well, after some 10 or 12 more towns, the military finally decided that they were being played with. And so they took a map and they followed his route, and they decided that pretty soon he was going to be in this town up here. So they were there waiting for him. When he came in through the gates of the town, they said, Fritz, you were going to sell books here, weren't you? Fritz says, yes, sir. You didn't tell me not to sell books in this town. Well, they said, now, we've been telling you all this time that you mustn't sell books, and you've just kept right on selling books. Now, he said, you are going to be held in contempt of this military court. And so he was called before the military tribunal, and the judge asked him, Fritz, is this the book that you've been selling? And he said, yes, sir. Didn't we tell you that you shouldn't be selling this book anymore? Yes, sir, but he said, I had orders from a higher authority than you that I should go on and sell these books. And until this authority, my boss told me not to, I had to keep on selling these books. Well, this military tribunal said, we don't know anything about any higher authority than we are, but you, by your own admission, admit that you are selling these books. We've told you that you shouldn't. They're against the government. It's treason. You shall be shot tomorrow morning at sunrise. So they put him in jail, put a guard of 6 soldiers taking turns to watch his cell. Now, he had 7 books left. And so as he was sitting in the cell, he was pondering not what was going to happen to him, but what he was going to do with those books. And so as the soldiers would be assigned one to sit by the door there while he was inside, he would call him in, and he would say, now, and he told me this story himself. He was working at our publishing house in Hamburg. He said, now, I have these books left. It doesn't look like I'm going to sell any more, at least for a while. And so he said, why don't you take one as a gift from me? Well, the soldier thanked him, and when the next soldier would come along, why, this soldier with his book would go and sit back out there in the other part of the jail and start reading. Well, he called each one of the 6 soldiers, so he got rid of 6 of his books. And all these soldiers were reading. Then the jailer came in at supper time with his supper, and he had 1 book left. And so he did the same thing with the jailer. He said, now, if you want to, I'll even autograph this book. And I think you and your family would enjoy reading this book. So why don't you take it as my compliments? And so the jailer did. He took the book, and he went back and started to read. But by that time, the soldiers had got far enough into the book that there were some questions that were bothering them. So they came streaming back into Fritz's cell, and they were asking questions about what it said in this book. So Fritz had the song service, and he started giving them a Bible study. Well, it wasn't too long until the jailer had some questions, and so he came in. And so there he had until about 10 or 11 that night, the 6 soldiers and the jailer, giving them a Bible study and just going at them as hard as he could. But they decided that he should get a little rest, and so they went their ways. The next morning, one of the soldiers came and tapped Fritz and said, it's almost daylight. We don't like to do this, but we have to carry out the orders of the court. And so they took Fritz outside, put him up in front of this brick wall, and the lieutenant that was there in charge said, now, Fritz, do you want to have a blindfold? And Fritz said, no, I'm not afraid to die. Well, he said, do you have anything to say? Fritz said, yes, sir. He said, I would like to tell you, first of all, Mr. Lieutenant, that I'm not holding you responsible. You're carrying out your orders as you were supposed to, as you were told to. But he said, I want you to know that I'm carrying out my orders, too. Now, he said, I have one request. And the lieutenant said, All right, if I can do it, I'll be glad to. The lieutenant said, I gave a book to the jailer. Now, he said, after you have carried out your duties and I'm no longer around, he said, I wish that you would go and borrow that book from the jailer and read it. I think it'll do you some good. Well, the lieutenant said, I don't like this kind of talk. I've got a job to do. Now let's get on with it. So the 6 soldiers lined up in front of Fritz, and 6 rifles came up to attention. The lieutenant stood there and clicked his heels, and he gave the order to aim, and 6 rifles were aimed right at Fritz. Now, normally when 6 rifles are aimed at you, and the order is given to pull 6 triggers, and 6 bullets go somewhere, you don't feel so good. You don't feel like standing up. You're kind of perforated, you know. But the 6 rifles barked, and there were 6 puffs of smoke, but Fritz didn't have any holes in him. He was still standing there feeling just fine. Well, the lieutenant kind of scratched his head just a minute, and he said, well, I know what happened. He said, those soldiers in this squad, they got friendly with Fritz. Fritz is a nice kid. I have nothing against him. I'm merely carrying out the orders of the court. But he said, I know what happened. Each one of those soldiers decided that they didn't want to be the one to kill Fritz. And so each one decided that they were going to aim just a little to one side and let the other 5 go ahead and kill him. But if all 6 soldiers had the same idea, naturally 6 bullets would go off to one side. But he says, I'll fix that. German efficiency, you know. So he got on the phone and called a squadron from another military post just a few miles away. And so in just a little bit, here comes another squad of soldiers that didn't know anything about Fritz. And so they lined up and they went through the same procedure. 6 rifles were raised. The order was given to pull 6 triggers, and there were 6 puffs of smoke, and 6 bullets went somewhere, all of them this time aimed at Fritz. But Fritz didn't have any holes in him, and he's still standing there. Well, this really was beginning to perturb the lieutenant. Finally, he said, I know. He said, if you want a job well done, you do it yourself. So he walked over to Fritz, and he pulled out his Luger pistol. He put it right at the temple of Fritz's head, and he pulled the trigger. Now, normally when a Luger pistol goes that way, and there's a big bang, and there's a puff of smoke, and that bullet comes out of the gun, really you don't feel good, do you? But there was no hole in Fritz's head. He was still standing there. What are you going to do when you can't kill a man? Well, they put him in jail a while, but Fritz is still selling books. Don't tell me that the angel of the Lord doesn't camp around them that fear him and deliver him. And that's in our day today, young people. And these things are going to come more and more to young people who maintain the standards of Joseph and Daniel.